Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alexander Stoffel, and I'm an editorial board member of the journal Historical Materialism. It is a pleasure to convene and moderate this discussion today on the founding of the Red Trade Union International, which is a book recently published by Brill in the Historical Materialism series and edited by Mike Tabor with contributions from Rainer Tostorff and Daria Diakonova. And we are very fortunate to have all three of them with us today. So let me introduce them in order of speakers. Mike Tabor is the editor of the founding of the Red Trade Union International and is the current director of the Comintern Publishing Project. He has edited a number of volumes on the history of the international socialist and communist movement, and his editorial work has made the proceedings of the early Comintern accessible to a new generation of scholars. Rainer Tostorff teaches at the History Department at Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany, and he is author of The Red International of Labor Unions, 1920 to 1937. Rainer has published monographs and articles on Spanish history, as well as on the international workers' movement in the 20th century, and his work really remains the definitive history of the Red International of Labor Unions. And finally, we have Daria Diakonova, who is a history researcher who teaches at the International University in Geneva, Switzerland. And she is co-editor of the Communist Women's Movement from 1920 to 1922. Daria's PhD thesis was on the Canadian Communist youth and its ties with the international communist movement during the interwar period. So the way that this event will work is that each of these three speakers will talk for about 15 minutes. And then afterward, I'll open a conversation among them with a few questions from myself before we turn over to the audience for a Q&A and discussion. Okay, that's all from me. Mike, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Alex. I'm pleased to be speaking here alongside Rainer and Daria, both of them distinguished historians of the early communist movement who assisted greatly in the publication of this volume. I want to start with the Comintern Publishing Project, which the book we're celebrating here is part of. That project, whose longtime general editor was John Riddell, is a decades-long undertaking to make available the record of the Communist International under Lenin, in its own words. The 11 volumes in the series published thus far show the Comintern in Lenin's time as a living movement, a movement of millions that advanced by fits and starts, making errors and then correcting them, feeling its way forward as it navigated one challenge after another. The last several installments have focused on one particular dimension of the Comintern, its auxiliary organizations. Inasmuch as the early Comintern was a broad mass movement with millions of members and supporters around the world, these auxiliary organizations had its own distinct features, with different histories and characteristics. The subject of the book we're discussing today was one of the most significant of these auxiliaries, certainly the largest, with millions of members in its affiliated unions. The Red International of Labor Unions, also known as the Red Trade Union International or the Profintern, which is a contraction of its name in Russian, had enormous potential at its birth. Despite its strength, however, this powerful movement is perhaps the least appreciated of all the Comintern's auxiliaries. Most historians have dealt with it rather harshly, either dismissing it entirely or belittling its importance. For this reason, the present volume on the 1921 founding Congress of the Red Trade Union International can help redress the imbalance and allow readers to make their own assessments. Together with Rainer Tostorff's magnificent history, those interested can now see more clearly not just the RILU's weaknesses and contradictions, but also its strengths and the enormous potential it had when it was born. In the pages of this volume, readers will find themselves transported to the world of a century ago, to the massive working class upsurge that followed the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the post-war revolutionary crisis that rocked the entire world. This crisis was marked by revolutionary struggles for power in Europe, by colonial revolts in Africa and Asia, and by massive strike waves in numerous countries, including in North America. In this context, the Red International of Labor Unions set out to build a revolutionary center of the world's union movement, working hand in hand with the Communist International. Its goal was to transform the unions, to conquer them, turning them into instruments of struggle to overthrow capitalism and to establish workers' rule around the world. In seeking to transform the unions, the Red International's founding Congress took up a number of issues of trade union strategy and tactics that remain key questions for union activists today. The RILU did this in opposition to the bureaucratically run International Federation of Trade Unions, known at the time as the Amsterdam International, which resembled most of the union federations we're familiar with today. I want to mention some of the aspects of the Red International's program so that you can see what I'm talking about. It called for industrial unionism as opposed to craft unionism. The idea was that all workers in a given industry should be united in one big union rather than spread out over numerous smaller ones divided by craft. It called for opposition to class collaborationism with the capitalist owners of industry, opposing things like profit-sharing schemes, labor management conciliation boards, and other such things that it viewed as tools to prevent workers from exercising their power. It called for direct action by workers themselves, putting their reliance on the ranks, not union officials, not labor boards, and not so-called friends of labor. Examples of such direct action that it put forward were strikes, factory occupations, workers' control initiatives, and similar things. And finally, the Red Trade Union International at its founding Congress called for trade union unity. Most historians over the last century have blamed the Red International for splitting the world trade union movement. But in actual fact, it was the Amsterdam Federation that did so, unilaterally expelling workers who supported the new left-wing formation. The Red International, for its part, opposed this split and defended trade union unity, calling for expelled unions to fight for readmission wherever they had been kicked out. All told, the Red International Congress adopted resolutions that laid out a positive program of class struggle unionism that bears study today. These are all issues that will take on increasing importance as the attacks on workers by world capitalism deepen. Another important aspect of the 1921 founding Congress that I want to highlight is the presence of syndicalist forces. This was one of the most significant aspects of the event from a historical standpoint. Syndicalism today is largely a fringe movement, but a century ago it was a key component of the world's labor movement, with millions of supporters and members internationally. In a number of countries, in fact, it was the dominant current in the Union, such as in France, Spain, Italy, much of Latin America. And in other countries, too, it also had important influence with proud histories. I'll just mention the industrial workers of the world in the United States and the shop stewards movement in Britain. The presence of these forces at the Red International's founding Congress was a demonstration of the power of the example of the Russian Revolution, which inspired millions of workers throughout the world. What did revolutionary syndicalism consist of? Perhaps the primary element was the idea that unions were the central instrument for carrying out revolutionary change. But syndicalists were not a homogeneous group. There were a number of different currents, some of them with sharply divergent views from each other. While there are features of the Red International Congress that could perhaps be criticized as being a little unjust to the syndicalist minority, particularly in the allocation of votes, it nevertheless has to be recognized that syndicalists at the Congress were afforded a platform to openly express their views, including sharply dissenting ones, and all opinions were given a hearing. This, in fact, was a feature of the international communist movement as a whole in its early days. Of course, this was prior to the stifling of all oppositional views under Stalin. The syndicalist presence at the Red International Congress led to the main debates that took place there. I'll mention a few of these. Whether to leave the old bureaucratized unions and found new ones based around a revolutionary program, as most syndicalists believed, or alternately, to stay within the unions and fight to transform them. Another question was, what should be the relationship of trade unions to political struggle? The French syndicalists in particular believed that all politics should be kept out of the unions. Communist unionists answered them that it was impossible to keep politics out of the unions, since every class struggle was simultaneously seen to be a political struggle. A debate also occurred on what should be the relationship between the Red Trade Union International and the Comintern. Some syndicalists considered themselves opponent of the communists and opposed any relationship at all with the Comintern. Other syndicalists were more friendly and advocated different forms of alliance. These debates show the early Communist International and the vast movement it represented at its best, with open debate of differing views, including sharply critical ones. Of course, within a few years, all this changed as the Red Trade Union International became a victim of the Stalinist degeneration in the Soviet Union and the world communist movement. But that's a whole other story. To read about that, I'd recommend Rainer Tostor's History, which gives us a graphic description of the various stages of the Red International's degeneration. Today, a century after the events recounted in this book, working people are again facing an offensive against their basic interests and conditions of life, along with the threat of war and growing rightist forces. These are being led at the present time by authoritarian and Bonapartist capitalist politicians such as Donald Trump and similar figures in other countries. The concept of militant international trade union action remains as necessary as it was 100 years ago. The challenges facing working people and their unions on a world scale are, if anything, even more closely interconnected with each other. As the phenomenon of capitalist economic globalization develops, so too is there a need for globalization of the working class struggle. In this context, the example and lessons of the Red Trade Union International of 100 years ago deserve serious study. While from an organizational standpoint, the Red International of Labor Unions cannot be presented as a model for future attempts at international working class action, it does provide important experiences that new generations can learn from. The Red International of Labor Unions, with all its strengths and weaknesses, remains an important part of the legacy of the Communist International under Lenin, whose lessons continue to be of relevance to those fighting for revolutionary social change in the world. One final point. The volume we're discussing today will obviously be useful for scholars and experts, containing valuable documentary material not previously available or accessible. Having the full historical record of the working class movement on hand is indispensable with all its lessons, both positive and negative. But the primary target audience for this book, as well as the entire series of volumes presented by the Comintern Publishing Project, consists of fighters for social change, radicalizing young people, militant workers and trade union activists, those eager to fight against the attacks on workers' rights and conditions, against the kidnapping and deportation of immigrant workers, against the growing power of far-right and fascist-type organizations, against imperialist wars and war moves. And in opposition to all these things, those coming to political struggle today need a vision of what we're for, a society based on human solidarity and social justice. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I follow you now, and you can hear me, I suppose. Well, thank you very much for having me on this presentation, for having me invited, and also especially for the kind words of Mike about my book. Yes, I have written a rather relatively comprehensive history from the beginning to the end of the Profintern. And why was that? There was very few works before that, mainly in Eastern European countries, Soviet books, Hungarian history, etc., Polish. The Polish book one was the most comprehensive at that time because he had been able already to work in the 80s in the archives. But my interest grew out of the following connection. And here I want to mention one of the leaders of the Profintern. Okay, the main central figure from the beginning to the end, which distinguishes it, which distinguished the Profintern from the Comintern was that it had its central leader from the beginning to the end, Alexander Lozovsky or Solomon Lozovsky, who became a victim, who was able, well, he was quite a flexible character, though he had collaborated with Trotsky in exile for some time. He was able to survive and then is now famous for his role as the leader of the Jewish anti-fascist committee during the Second World War, a propaganda instrument of the Soviet state for the Jews of the world. And well, it's a different story, but then he became a victim in the new anti-Semitic purge after 48, 47. But that's an interesting story, but not the one we can discuss here. But he had until 28, of course, a deputy leader, a second is deputy as in the secretariat of the Profintern, which was Andreu Nin, a Catalan revolutionary, whom I had dealt with in my thesis, my PhD thesis on the poem. Spanish Civil War, 36, 37. Andreu Nin became famous as a victim, worldwide famous in all the description of the Spanish Civil War, all the books about it, beginning by Orwell, etc., until more historiographical works. Well, I dealt with this chapter, and then, well, from that, I thought, how did he come to Russia in the early 20s? And I discovered his role as a leader of the CNT, the famous syndicalist, also a bit anarchist, a labor federation in Spain. And that brought me to study the role of syndicalists in the beginning of the international communist movement. And this was a thing which I thought was rather underrated until then. Because, the main works dealing with the Comintern history or already in the early 20s under Lenin was how did the Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party split and come over, the left wing did come over to the Comintern. And I realized that this was only a part of the story. The role of the syndicalists was very important in a series of countries, and other countries not so much. For example, in Germany, there were not unimportant, but relatively marginal movement. But for other countries, Mike mentioned a few, this wasn't the case. To the contrary, especially, well, beginning with Spain, but also in Italy, France, the famous CGT, and so on. And this was my starting point, the role of the syndicalists, because I realized, well, the Socialist Party had been centered around election strategies before the second war, in the Second International, before World War One, and a lot of the discussions which led to the splits after 1990, 1920, and so on. It also centered around the question of elections and, well, partially, of course, parliament versus council, etc., but not so much about, let's say, industrial action. And this was something which the syndicalists brought into the discussions because of their, well, let's say, ideological baggage, to say it very simply. And they had stressed this role as the central tasks of socialists, of revolutionaries, of labor activists, already before World War One, and then, of course, they saw that this was also necessary after 1920. And this, while on the one hand, most of them, to different degrees, sympathize with the Russian Revolution, they rejected all kind of, let's say, electoral activities and so on. Now, this was, let's say, these were the discussions in 1920 when the Communist International, with its Second World Congress, very well documented in the volumes of the Comintern History Project, centered around these questions, and the syndicalists, whom the Bolsheviks had been very interested to bring to them, had invited them, said, no, this is not the real place to come to a common understanding. So on the other hand, there was, you mentioned the Amsterdam International, of course, led by the Social Democratic Party. So they had also had undergone a process of radicalization and so on. So were a mixture of left Amsterdam delegates and the syndicalist delegates in Moscow in 1920. And then the Bolsheviks had not a clearly formulated policy. They had different proposals, or to invite the unionists or revolutionary unions to join the Comintern, or, well, then they realized this was, they rejected it, or it was too complicated. One had to build a bridge, and so they decided to put up this kind of International Revolutionary Trade Union Council, and this organized then the Congress of 1921, which is now documented in the volume. And many of the, let's say, the content of the discussions has already been mentioned by Mike, so I will not repeat this. But that is what brought me to also to follow up the story until 1937, when it was dissolved. And I can't repeat this history or even summarize it now in a few sentences. It would be much too long. But then after 21, it begins to, well, let's say, join the history of the Comintern in a certain sense. with all its ups and downs. And then what we would have to see is the different stages of the Comintern's development until it was dissolved in 43, but practically it was that already in the 30s. So the Profintern was dissolved only a few years earlier for tactical reasons. So yes, a few words. So this is the whole, a few sentences, the whole story which is discussed in my book, and perhaps a few words how I was able to approach this history. Of course, this is already mentioned in the, or already used in the earlier, in the Comintern Congress volumes, and the one on the women's movement, etc., and also on some anti-imperialist congresses, the Comintern archives. And when until 1990, as I said, only East European from the so-called befriended communist parties with the CPSU were able to work a bit in the archives. The Profintern archives were a bit more open than in the 30s already. But of course, what most people interested were with the key decisions which were taken on in the Comintern leadership. But of course, this changed in 1990, and I was able then, well, I was joined the legion of researchers. I was lucky to find funding for this, which, well, went to see what is there, the treasure trove in Moscow in the Comintern archives, and I found the Profintern archives very well ordered in could work even on let's say mention a bit of this, especially for the 80s. This is on the more close sections which dealt with intelligence work, let's say, the relation with the NKVD and so on, how it influenced, especially in the 30s, the purges and so on. So there's a lot to be found. And as I said, this was possible without any problems in the 1990s. I don't know how this would be if I would go there to Moscow now under the current conditions. But yes, I concentrated on what the material. Sorry, the material there is enormous. I mean, I could have, with more time, have written a 2,000 pages book, but then I would have gone into too detailed questions. Now there's correspondence, the trade unions all around the world who collaborated in one sense or another with the Comintern, sent a lot of material. So if you want to deal with more specialist cases or more specialist studies, you still find there a lot of things which I haven't explored. In some historiographical work on parties, you will find these material to good use. Let's say next year we will have the anniversary of the Passaic strike in 1926. There's a lot of it, as I've seen in some works on the CPUSA and so on, but then also in other countries. It's now such as a worldwide movement. It's also a question of linguistics. You have worked on I've been told, on a lot of Chinese material and so on. So there's still much to explore, but I think I have concentrated on the main questions which were discussed at the different congresses and other meetings on the central question of how the purges were brought into the Profintern, the Stalinization process, and so on, and also how it became from the mid-20s on used as a let's say, as a bureaucratic apparatus to maneuver in let's say more Soviet diplomacy than in revolutionary activities. I've dealt especially beginning with the mid-20s in the overtures of the Comintern of the Soviet Union towards the Amsterdam International, which was especially important in the mid-30s during the Popular Front era, when, as a result of it, the Profintern was dissolved as an offer towards the social democratic leadership of the IFTU. But I've also dealt with internal conflicts between the Russian trade unions and the Profintern, and also after 28. If you look at the material after 28, you see an enormous amount of new revolutionary unions. Of course, was the result of the turn of 28, 29 towards social fascism and union splitting and so on. But what is very clear, and they also had a theory that, reformists, the revolutionary unions are the school of communism, so the dominant reformist unions were the school of capitalism and so on, which was too ultra-left, so they even then were had to renounce it after 32, when they realized how this ended in a lot of let's say, unions on paper. So you can accompany the history of the Profintern from 20 on. After these, the fusion was made between a part of the syndicalists and the pro-Bolsheviks forces, the Comintern of the Profintern plus the Comintern, as a kind of a revolutionary family, then accompanied with additional the Youth International and the women's congresses and so on, the Women's Secretariat. So in this sense, it's also, it's a history of its own right in a certain sense, but it's a core part of the history of the communist movement, the national communist movement in general. So much what I would say here very briefly.
All right. Is it my turn to speak? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Wonderful. Yeah, so thanks a lot for having me on this panel. I'm really happy to discuss Mike's book. I'm really happy to see Rainer on the screen. I used his book as a foundation for an article I wrote for as part of an edited collection. It's an article on communist women within the Profintern. Mike's book was not out yet at the time, but he kindly shared documents from the book with me, so I used this material as well. So I will focus, well, Mike and I are longtime collaborators. You probably know that we co-edited a collection on the communist women's movement. Oh, I guess Mike mentioned that actually earlier. So I will focus on the involvement of communist women in the work of the Profintern, and basically what we can learn about this from Mike's book. So women who actively participated in the Profintern's founding Congress and then in its work throughout its existence were women who belonged to another Comintern's auxiliary organization, the Communist Women's Movement. The Profintern did have women workers from the very beginning, although an actual women's section of the Profintern that would coordinate internationally the work of women members related to women workers' needs and demands would appear a few years after its foundation in 1928. So before 1928, these were mainly women from the Communist Women's Movement who were active in advancing women workers' rights within the Profintern. Okay, so let me now say a few words about how these communist women addressed the question of trade unions and women's role in them. So when the Communist Women's Movement's delegates convened in Moscow for their founding conference in July 1920, labor relations between the sexes and the participation of women in the labor movement and trade unions were core points on the agenda. Many delegates who took the floor pointed out the growing importance of women workers within trade unions, which was the result of women's mass entry into industries during World War I. Indeed, women became important actors in labor politics, particularly after 1914. Things, however, changed once the war ended and men returned to their workplaces. And let me give you a quote by Alfred Rosmer, the French delegate at the 1920 conference, women's conference, who would also participate in the Profintern founding Congress. And you can see him quite a lot in the proceedings in Mike's book. So at the women's conference, Rosmer says, male workers, this is a quote, male workers in trade unions, for their part, seemed not only indifferent to the task of organizing women workers, but even showed hostility. They not only did nothing to attract women to their trade unions, but on the contrary, they tried to discourage in every possible way those who came to the trade unions and spoke for the women, asking for help with organizing women workers. Some federations, Rosmer added, quoting the example of the Printers' Union in France, refused to admit women workers as members of the union. The situation in France was not unusual. Many trade unions worldwide were reluctant to admit or support women workers. The young Soviet state intended to fight such tendencies in Soviet trade unions and encouraged women's entry and participation. However, changes were slow. In capitalist countries, the Communist Women's Movement called on parties to promote women's participation and leadership in those trade union structures where communists had influence. The conference called for the second Communist Women's Movement's conference, which convened in the summer of 21, encouraged parties and unions to send women representatives to the founding Congress of the Profintern, which indeed would happen. But let me go back to the second conference, summer 21, before the meeting of the founding Congress of the Profintern. So the delegates who spoke at this second women's conference underscored the importance of work among women within trade unions and special measures and methods the future International Red Union should adopt in order to address the position of women within the labor movement. German delegate, German communist Gertrude Faber urged participants of the second conference to approach the forthcoming Profintern Congress and encourage the future Profintern to consider the woman question. As a result, the conference adopted a resolution calling for this action. All right, let me now go back to the Profintern's founding Congress. It's important to note that at this Congress, a few male comrades who actually did enjoy certain authority among a variety of delegates. So a few male comrades raised the question of women's unionization, women's role within the new Red International. So these were Fritz Heckert from Germany, elected to the Profintern Presidium at the founding Congress, who actually represented not just Germany, but also Austria, Hungary, and Switzerland, and who would later become a member of the Profintern's Central Council and Executive Bureau. Another person was William Haywood, also a major and well-known trade unionist, one of the founders of the International Workers of the World, and Jack Murphy from Britain, also a well-known and respected organizer. So these men urged to resist all discrimination against women in the Profintern, but also elsewhere in any other trade unions where revolutionaries were present. They also pointed to the importance to keep existing and introducing new protective measures for women. And you can find their arguments on this question in the book. And there were also, of course, women at the founding Congress. The report on women in trade unions was given by Hertha Sturm, a German member of the Communist Women's Movement and of its International Women's Secretariat. And this was like an international coordinating body for the Communist Women's Movement. So she was basically a part of the leadership, international leadership between 21 and 24. So in her report, she spoke about the divisions within the proletariat and specifically the trade union movement on the question of women's employment and their integration into the labor movement. A discussion of the report followed with two prominent communist women involved, Clara Zetkin, who I think does not need to be specially introduced here, but also Rosa Bloch, a Swiss communist who is less known, but who was also a member of the International Women's Secretariat. As Mike notes in his introduction to the book, Sturm's report laid out the importance of women's role in the workforce and in the unions. In line with this, she urged workers to fight for equal pay for equal work, against discriminatory layoffs for women, for strengthening women's participation in the unions and their leadership, and seeing women as comrades in struggle, not as competitors of male workers. Sturm also spoke about the importance of protective measures for women and working mothers, and about the double burden of women who did most care work at home on top of working outside of their homes. In this connection, she argued that it was vital for the Profintern to address the needs of housewives, a demand that was in line with discussions that took place within the Communist Women's Movement and which promoted the transformation of housework and the domestic economy into paid forms of socialized labor. The Congress integrated these ideas into its resolution on women's work and its program of action. the resolution was in fact written by a commission of women delegates to the founding Congress. And let me now just quote 2 points, points 3 and 4 of the resolution. You can find the resolution, the complete resolution in the book. Okay, so point 3. Members of the Red Trade Unions must energetically fight the efforts of the capitalist employers aided by the governments to increase their profits and strengthen and maintain their industries by utilizing the cheap labor of unorganized women. It is therefore their duty, whenever wages are being fixed in wage scale agreements and in the relief of the unemployed, to come out for placing women workers on an equal footing with male workers in the same line of work. They must further exert their untiring efforts to improve the working conditions for women engaged in industry. They must put up a decisive fight against the weakening of the legislation for the protection of women workers and take up the fight for having these laws thoroughly improved and made more comprehensive, special attention being given to the protection of pregnant women, women confined after childbirth, and maternity. So that was point 3, and let me now read point 4. It's shorter. Members of the trade unions must put up an insistent, energetic fight against all efforts and attempts on the part of the craft unions affiliated with the Amsterdam International, mentioned by Mike, to force women out of industrial employment in favor of men. They should brand and fight all attempts of these organizations working in concert with the employers to win small advantages for male workers at the cost of neglecting the interests of women workers. Rosa Bloch and Clara Zetkin then intervened after this report, pointing to the urgency of acting upon the resolution on women's work. In another resolution dealing with the organization of women in the trade unions, the founding Congress delegates agreed upon making the organization of women in trade unions a prerequisite for the unions to be able to join the Profintern. So one more small quote here. Once again, you can find the complete resolution in the book. Only those unions that have freed themselves from the old prejudices and have taken upon themselves to defend and safeguard the labor of women merit being members of the Red International of Labor Unions. The aim before them is the same, increasing the army of the social revolution by new and tireless fighters recruited from the exploited and oppressed women workers. So to sum it all up, but I think the quotes speak for themselves, the founding Congress laid strong foundations for the strengthening of women's participation in the unions and their leadership. All right, now let me say a few words to conclude about how things actually work or not in practice and what happens to women's activism within the Profintern after the founding Congress. So at the founding Congress, women were still a tiny minority. Though a small group, they immediately began implementing the goals laid out in the Profintern's resolutions. However, toward the end of the year, German delegates had to admit that this work had not advanced much, and the situation was similar in other countries. But there were some exceptions. This was, of course, the case of the Soviet Union, where women by 1922 represented 38% of the total trade union membership, but also Bulgaria, where in 21 communists controlled almost the entire trade union movement and had many women members. At a meeting in Berlin in January 23, the International Women's Secretariat worked out a plan for the Profintern's activism among women workers. The objective was familiar, involving women in all of the proletariat's political and economic struggle. At the same time, the plan included some very specific, new and ambitious, for the time, demands. There's a whole list of demands, but I think it's important to mention all of them because they were truly ahead of the time. And basically, communist women within the Profintern came up with something truly radical and revolutionary as far as women's rights and protection are concerned. So they included abolition of Saturday afternoon work for women, a decrease in the working hours for women agricultural workers, domestic servants, nurses, and other professions not covered by the legislation for industrial workers, the abolition of overtime for women, a reduction of working hours in dangerous and hazardous industries, 14 fully paid days off, health and accident insurance and allowances, measures to ease the burden of housework for housewives, and the establishment of facilities that would transform housework into, including care work, into collective work by employers. Daycare and school facilities, 16 weeks of maternity leave. That was something nobody really talked about at the time. A 6-hour working day for nursing mothers and breaks to breastfeed at the workplace. Finally, if measures were adopted by the employers, communist women called for creation of special inspections to ensure employer compliance with these measures. Communist women demanded equal pay for equal work and the abolition of take-home work for fully employed women workers. The Third Profintern Congress of 1924 integrated these demands into its resolutions. And for the next few years, the International Women's Secretariat of the Communist Women's Movement remained the major body charged with the implementation, as far as possible, of the decisions of the Profintern. But it was only in 1928, just before the Profintern's Fourth Congress, that the Red International itself established a special women's committee within its structures. And naturally, cadres for that committee came from the Communist Women's Movement. The turn coincided and was arguably encouraged by the Comintern's left turn and the increased competition between the Profintern and the IFTU over women workers, among other things. At the beginning, this new permanent body, which was called the International Trade Union Committee of Women Workers of the Profintern, a very long name, had representatives from Britain, the US, China, France, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Mexico, Italy, Poland, Norway, the USSR, Bulgaria, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Over the subsequent years, more national sections joined in. So these women articulated, once they started working as a group, articulated even more radical program, which called for a 7-hour workday, 6 hours in dangerous industries, a 4-hour workday on Saturday, 1 month of paid holiday, prohibitions of women's night work and overtime, 16 weeks of paid maternity leave and employer-supported daycare facilities. What's new here? Equal unemployment benefits for men and women, which was also a contentious issue at the time. A new addition to this list was the demand to install women-only dressing rooms, washrooms, and showers at factories and anywhere else where women worked for wages. The new body coordinated work on the international level, and Profintern national sections were to support women trade unionists at the national level. It was, however, one thing to adopt a policy as part of a resolution at an international congress, but quite another for local leaders and rank-and-file members to put the policy into effect on the ground. Women indeed faced numerous difficulties, such as the lack of support on the part of trade union leadership, discrimination against women's organizations, and ordinary sexism. That said, women in the Profintern were reluctant to ignore such difficulties. On the contrary, they pushed the Profintern leadership to fight against such attitudes within its ranks and effectively promoted their specific agenda. And let me conclude by saying that, well, as Mike and Rainer mentioned, the Profintern was rather short-lived, and so was the International Trade Union Committee of Women Workers of the Profintern. With the Comintern's adoption of the Popular Front policy, already mentioned, the Profintern became an obstacle to trade union unity, and in early 1936, when the Profintern was transformed into a department of the Comintern's Executive Committee, its Women's Committee, alongside youth and agitation sections, were liquidated. And as you have heard, the Red International itself did not last long after this. In late 1937, the Comintern made the decision to dissolve it. Yeah, thanks a lot, and I'm happy to continue the discussion with your questions.
Wow, thank you all so much for your presentations and comments. I have prepared a couple of questions for the panel, although I do want to invite our viewers on YouTube to put any questions that you might have in the chat, because we'll have time later on to put them to our speakers. So we have just around 30 minutes left. I had a question for you all. So some people have claimed that the Comintern and its auxiliaries, like the Red Trade Union International, were largely extensions of Soviet government policy. And one question I had was, to what extent, if any, was this true during the period of the founding RLU Congress? That's to any or all of you. Yeah, Mike, although you are muted.
Well, I mean, there's two sides to this question. On one side, Soviet foreign policy, and on the other, the Comintern and its auxiliaries. As to Soviet policy, its cornerstone in the around the in the under Lenin and in the period that we're discussing, of this book, was extension of the world revolution. That in this there was an identity of overall aims with the Comintern. That doesn't mean that there weren't tensions on occasion, along with charges that on various questions the Comintern policy was being subordinated to the Soviet government at various times. And I'll just give one example of something that came up at the Red International's 1921 Congress, which was the case of the imprisoned Russian anarchists, which caused the greatest furor at the Congress, especially on the part of syndicalist delegates. And you can read about that in the book. But as we know, under Stalin, the Soviet, especially by the mid 1930s, the Soviet Communist Party and state had abandoned the perspective of world revolution toward one of peaceful coexistence with world capitalism, and that of building socialism in one country. And as part of this, the Comintern became entirely subordinated to the narrow Soviet interests, which were often in contradiction with those of the the working class internationally, and that helps to explain a number of the zigzags on Comintern policy, starting in the mid 1920s from the the ultra-left third period, the Popular Front line, all the way up into the various stages of the Stalin-Hitler Pact, the German invasion of Soviet Russia, and so forth.
We have one question, or sorry, Daria or Reiner, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I could just add a few words on this. Yeah, just to say that, well, yeah, I think we cannot really conflate Soviet foreign policy or governmental policy, whatever you call it, with Comintern policies, and historians are divided on this question as well. Some historians of the Comintern and of Soviet foreign policy have argued that the Comintern was an auxiliary, and its auxiliary organizations could be seen as extensions and tools of the Soviet policy. But since the 90s and the opening of the Soviet and Comintern archives, scholars in Soviet foreign policy shed new light on USSR-Comintern relationship and challenged the assumption that Moscow was the omnipotent master of the Comintern. Such scholars as Gabriel Gorodetsky, Sabine Dulin, Michael Carley, or Valery Shishkin showed that relationship between the Comintern and the Soviet government was far from harmonious. There were a lot of tensions, and Mike also mentioned that. And these tensions basically reflected the conflicts between the Soviet Commissariat for Foreign Affairs and the Soviet government overall, and the Comintern throughout the interwar period. And many of the Comintern documentary collections edited by John Riddell, by Mike, and the one we did together on the Communist Women's Movement point to a lot of autonomy, right, of the national sections and freedom of discussion during the Comintern and its affiliated organizations' international gatherings in the early 20s. And yeah, the example that Mike gave is very good, right? With this kind of open opposition and conflict between Bukharin and Sirol, right? But what it also shows, apart from the possibility of diverging opinions, is also another element, which is the differences among Soviet leadership and Soviet participants at the Profintern Congress. For instance, if we take this anarchist case, although the Russian delegation represented by Rykov and Tseperovich issued a statement on behalf of the delegation protesting against Sirol's speech and supporting Bukharin's argument, we know that at the same time, fruitful negotiations around the release of Russian anarchists was going on between European syndicalists and Lenin and Lunacharsky. And this resulted in the eventual departure from Russia of these anarchists. And then another point I wanted to make, it's not about the, it's about the overall interwar period. There are quite a few books on national sections. And I have also, I did a thesis, which I'm transforming into a book on Canadian communists, which shows that, yes, the Comintern tried to impose its line on national sections. However, it did not always succeed in that, right? There was a lot of opposition and sometimes successful opposition. And there were also initiatives coming from national sections that influenced the Comintern. Basically, the Popular Front was initially an initiative by Spanish and French national sections and was eventually adopted by the Comintern.
Thank you. So we have some questions come in. One question from the chat is, this person says, this is a bit beyond the founding of the Red International, but could someone speak to what, if any, connections, whether formal or ideological or cultural, existed between the Profintern and the Spanish CNT at the time of the revolution there?
Yes, maybe I'll try to answer it. I understand that this refers to the years 36, 37 revolution. Well, it's usually regarded as Spanish Revolution, not to the early years of 2021 of the time of the founding Congress, which is well documented. Besides, on this early period, as I said, I worked there in the 90s. After that, several people have studied national cases. And on the early CNT, there's a new thesis, or well, it's already 2 or 3 years old, has been published by, I think, Routledge, on the CNT in 2021, which adds a lot of details to what I have written and what is included in Mike Tabor's volume on the CNT, how they discussed it in 2021. But of course, it seems that this question refers to 36. And as we had already mentioned, that after 34, popular frontism became the official line. And whatever you might think about autonomy of Communist International and of the RIU and other auxiliary organizations, for such a general line, this does not relate. I mean, the turn of towards an alliance after 34 of the Soviet Union with the Western powers was dominant and also mentioned in the case of the trade unions that the Profintern was dissolved in a series of steps. One of the first steps was in 34 when all these revolutionary unions, which were proclaimed after 28, 29, which in reality were nothing, were essentially a second edition of the party. You had the Trade Union Unity League in the United States, and in Spain there was also a revolutionary union founded in 30 or 31 by the Communist Party, and these were liquidated from 34 onwards. I think the entrance, the dissolution of the Communist Union Federation in Spain was at the end of 35, and they joined the Socialist Trade Union Federation, UGT. So there was no Profintern presence there any longer in Spain. Even from early 36 on, the Profintern leadership is liquidated in a series of steps, and they dissolved all additional. The Profintern had a lot of auxiliary organizations by themselves for black workers, for marine workers, etc. They were all liquidated in 36. It was ended there. So nothing more during the Spanish Civil War. Yes, I think that this is
Excellent. Another question we had in the chat was there any contradiction between Lenin's attitude toward unions in left-wing communism and infantile disorder and the proclamation of a separate international of unions? Perhaps Mike?
Well, I know that this is something there's often a tendency to conflate the founding of the Red International of Labor Unions in 1921 with the line adopted in the late 1920s during the third period. This is the so-called third period of, of, of pulling communists out of the main trade unions and building separate red trade unions. But in fact, these were totally different. The Red International at the time did not call for building separate unions apart from the existing ones. It called for being in there and fighting to transform them into instruments of class struggle. They called for the existing unions to disaffiliate from the Amsterdam Federation and to join the Profintern on the other side. That was Moscow versus Amsterdam, the line. It's important to recognize that the Amsterdam Federation, the Amsterdam International in and of itself, was not a trade union. It was a political body that presented a line for trade unions to follow. So it was what the supporters of the Profintern were calling was for the big unions, unions all over the world, to affiliate with the Profintern rather than Amsterdam. It was not a call for withdrawing from the existing unions and building separate ones. So I don't think there was any contradiction between the position that Lenin had presented in left-wing communism, which was for communists not to withdraw from the unions. And in fact, that was one of the debates at the 1921 Congress, because a number of the syndicalist forces from Germany and other countries called for precisely that, for revolutionaries to get out of the unions and to build separate organizations.
Yes, Rainer.
Yes, one has to see the quite unique situation. Originally, the Bolsheviks in 1999, well, they had not discussed this very much. I mentioned a few articles then during these first 2 years before the second Congress of the Comintern in the summer of 2020, that as in the first international, unions and parties as well, and even cooperatives, would join together in one international. But the question is one thing to have a strategic or revolutionary concept, whatever clever it is argued, but then of course it was reality. And as I said, several syndicalist federations, unions, mass organizations like the CNT from Spain came into the Second World Congress, and they said, this is a Congress of parties. We do not participate in elections, but we are revolutionaries. We want to collaborate with you or join you or whatever, but not in an international of parties. And so this trade union council was set up as a kind of body, as a kind of even a concession to syndicalists. So, but on the other hand, there were countries where it was clear that the established social democratically led labor unions were dominant, like Germany or Britain, the TUC, and so on. But of course, there were revolutionaries inside there, communists there. The German Communist Party at its heyday in 21, 22, controlled about or influenced about a third of the German Labor Federation, of the RDGB, and so on. So in 21, already at the founding Congress, we have a combination, organizationally quite unique, of independent revolutionary organizations, where they existed, because there were also countries where there were already existing out of their own tradition, and the minorities inside the let's say simplified set reformist mass unions. So this was a combination of let's say two types of organizations. But what differs this from the development after 28 was that from 28 onwards, or 29 to be more precise, was we leave the reformist organizations because they are social fascist helpers or helpers of social fashion and so on, and it's not interested. We are not interested any longer to influence this. But in 21, this was different. The general line was we stay where we are. In Spain, well, there's a revolutionary mass organization, so we join them. Or, for example, in New York, the very important Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union had been split from the AFL, but was dominant in the garment workers industry. So, of course, communists there stayed there and did not rejoin the AFL. Or on the other hand, in the AFL, where there were in other unions, they did not say, let's split from the AFL. Or, for example, as I had mentioned already, forthcoming next year, the anniversary of the Passaic strike, the line was not to leave the AFL. Well, another thing is how the AFL handled this, but this is another question. So, difference between 21 and 29 has to be well regarded. So that's it.
Thank you. Daria, did you want to add anything? No?
No,
Okay.
it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we only have just under 10 minutes left. So what I wanted to do is I did want to give you each an opportunity to speak about the contemporary relevance of the book. So may I ask simply, what can today's trade unionists and political organizers and activists learn from the RILU's attempt to unite labor across borders? Do you have any reflections? Perhaps we could start with you, Mike, and then go in order.
Well, I mean, one current example I think that sort of poses this question is what happened in Italy this past September and October, where there were a series of general strikes by unions to protest Italy's complicity with Israeli genocide in Gaza. I think many of us around the world were inspired by this act of international solidarity, which showed the potential power of the working class. What if, but it sort of poses the question, what if this action weren't confined to Italy, and if instead you had similar organized strikes in numerous countries at the same time? Well, it's exactly such a prospect that the Red International Labor Union set out to create a century ago. And, we can learn from the overall perspective as well as the specific initiatives it took around various questions, such as solidarity with Soviet Russia and Soviet Hungary at the time. Today, there are many other fields of united struggle needed across borders. And I'll only mention the need for unions internationally to oppose xenophobic attacks on immigrants and other nationalist campaigns around tariffs and so on. And on these questions, international trade union action is sorely needed, and we can see what the potential, of what they can accomplish.
So yes, well, I can add only a few words, or essentially no other idea what I would say. it's what distinguishes these early beginnings of the Profiternist fight against any kind of discrimination along sex, gender, race, nationalism, and so on, national divide. For example, we had in Europe a lot of countries in the early 1920s with the question of national minorities and so on. And that this is a lesson which has to be followed and is followed. And then, of course, to look where the masses are. Well, of course, this is a very general. These are very general rules, but in that sense, these are the ideas of which were important then and which are still important now. So, say it briefly.
Thank you.
Okay. I do join both answers. And just to take up Mike's point on international solidarity, we can also think of interpolitical or transpolitical solidarity. And the Profintern Founding Congress was an example of that, right? Where you had communists and syndicalists working together and being able to come to resolutions and decisions together. And then obviously a very important point is the rejection of class collaboration and business unionism, which mostly happens today, right? In most unions that we have today, we hardly ever hear trade unionists speaking about class unity based on class struggle, right? Trade unity based on class struggle. And finally, as far as women are concerned, the Profintern adopted in form of resolutions a truly revolutionary program, as I said earlier, regarding working women's rights and the role they should play in trade union movement. And the subsequent congresses I mentioned demonstrated Profintern's long-term commitment to this very advanced for that time program, despite certain difficulties that I spoke about. The thing is that the demands that communist women within the Profintern fought for over 100 years ago are under attack. Many of them are under attack today. So it's urgent to look once again, look back, right, at that experience, at that agenda, at those demands, and and learn some lessons from that experience.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, with just 1 or 2 minutes to spare, that's actually a really wonderful place to end our discussion. So I want to thank you all, Mike, Reiner, and Daria, for joining us and for your wonderful presentations, and also to sorry. Sorry, maybe I thought Mike, did you say something? I didn't want to interrupt. No? And also thank everybody who was listening and who sent in their questions. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I hope you enjoy your afternoons or evenings wherever you are. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.